Welcome to my show, When Everyone Wins, where a key goal I have for you is shifting from power over and under to power within and between. I'm your host, Judy Ryan. In each episode, I'll share my knowledge from decades in workplace culture transformation and leadership development as the founder and CEO of LifeWorks Systems. I'll help you build trust and emotional and social intelligence. My show, When Everyone Wins, is about creating a life you love and helping others do the same. Welcome, everyone, to the show. I want to let you know that we're going to be speaking today with Felix Nater on the topic of how a win-win culture shifts violence into caring community. And it's a beautiful vision to have win-win, but sometimes it's a little harder to put it into motion than we think if we're not willing to look at the best and the worst case scenarios that can happen. So I'm very excited to welcome my guest today. Felix Nater is the president, the founder, and the owner of Nater Associates. He's a nationally recognized, highly skilled workplace violence prevention advisor and consultant. He helps firms implement and manage workplace security strategies with a focus on workplace violence prevention. He provides security consulting, training, and security awareness, program development, and program management. Felix is also retired from federal law enforcement with more than 30 years of investigative law enforcement, program management, and security experience. He also has experience in the Army Reserve and was a leader in the Postal Services. So welcome, Felix. So happy to have you.
That's a great introduction. I'm humbled. And the one thing that you left out from my bio is I love what I do. I truly love what I do.
That is so great, because my first question to you was, how did you get into this field and what motivates you? So it's certainly helpful when you're motivated by loving what you do. So
Absolutely.
tell our
Absolutely.
listeners a little about all of that.
So as a postal inspector, there are various assignments, a variety of different assignments that come my way. I was known as a troubleshooter. And the last 8 years of my career were spent on workplace violence, a new program headed up by the chief postal inspector that he wanted within each of the divisions to focus in on how to help leaders within the postal service that were non-law enforcement deal with it from a preventive orientation perspective. And at first, I was frightened to death. I admit that I didn't know how to approach it. My skills were not adequate at the moment. But as I progressed and I availed myself of learning opportunities and letting myself experience the differences in approach to this, I began to enjoy it. And I spent 8 years between Long Island, New York and Queens, New York, helping the postmasters and the executives in charge on Long Island and Queens understand that an ounce of prevention is really worth a pound of cure.
Yes.
How you treat people is the way you will be treated, and how you regard them is the way how you will be regarded. And my philosophy went over very well.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for admitting that to learn something new takes time, and that it's just our willingness and our purposefulness to make a positive difference. So good for you, because a lot of what we do in our work with LifeWorks Systems takes people time to become proficient at it. And it's kind of interesting. I'm sure people make a lot of comments to you about people going postal, because that's got such a reputation. But what it's really all about is the stress that comes when people become afraid. Yes. And this is a time where a lot of people are feeling afraid. What's going on in our country in the United States, what's going on in the world right now. So it's a very important topic for us to be able to talk about our vision for the best, but also what are some of the most challenging things that can get in the way of that best.
Yes.
Even when we come into a client site, we start with what causes struggle. And that's kind of the same thing that you're doing, only you're actually taking it to that level of when it even turns into violence. Because it is part of struggle that it turns into war, or all the isms and all the things that go wrong. So tell us a little bit about what you encounter and what you do to raise awareness and why people hire you. Like, what are the things that happen that they are ready to look at that violence that goes on?
Thank you very much for that important question. So there are two major services that I offer under my umbrella: consulting and training. And the consulting piece discusses what the eventual training would look like. But if you're paying attention to the concepts and the ideas I leave you with in the consulting phase, you really, really learn to begin appreciating the value of prevention from a strategic point of view. What can we as senior leaders do to help the workforce wrap their arms around their expectations of work behaviors, and to appreciate that the systems that are in place are designed to let us know what's bothering you. So I go in and I help organizations assess and evaluate their current posture, and I render a informal and sometimes informal finding of my observations. And while they may think that they have a good up and running program, I invariably always discover gaps in their misunderstanding of how to apply it, and I offer suggestions. And the training can never ever come before their understanding of what it is. What is workplace violence prevention? What it is that you think you were doing correctly, but you were operating under a myth. Why aren't employees involved in making contributions to what the training should look like? Because these are the areas that cause, chasms. And when you don't invite an adult employee to make a contribution to training, you're pretty much dismissing their value, and you're not really appreciating them. So I go into it from a different point of view, not to focus in on the violence, but to focus in on creating a culture of understanding and appreciation and regard.
Do most of the people that bring you in look at it through the preventive lens, or are they usually bringing you in because they've incurred a problem and they're aware that they have a violence problem? Like, which is it, kind of
Yes.
both, or?
Yes. So for the most part, they're reluctant to hire someone because they think they have the resources internally. When they have a problem, the internal resources says we have to reach out and contact a professional to help us really assess and evaluate our current posture. My ideal clients, Judy, are clients who recognize this now before they have a problem and wish to assess and evaluate their current posture with the intentions of introducing new approaches, new philosophies, new
They're
methodologies.
already kind of they're already kind of forward thinking. They're already
Yes,
kind of looking at, we don't want to wait till we have a problem. We want to
yes,
prevent the problem. That's excellent. That's excellent.
yes.
A lot of time, Felix, with our clients, they'll bring us in because they have a problem, and then they recognize that the workplace culture was a contributing factor to that.
I
Uh,
think
so
I think when they call me in under those conditions, I'm useless to them. I don't want to be reactionary, because when it's reactionary, the workforce reads through my honorable intentions, but perceive it as just another band-aid effect. And
well,
so I'm discouraged from being involved.
that's wonderful. And I think that you're kind of looking for those leaders that are forward thinking and aware of the possibilities, or aware of maybe that the conditions that are in place are lend themselves to more potential violence or struggles, that sort of thing. That's the kind of client we're always looking for too. The ones that are sort of reading out ahead of what's coming in the future, and what are the stressors that people are going through, and what are some of the best case and worst case scenarios for dealing or not dealing with that. So it sounds like you are brought in ideally when people are aware that they want to prevent that problem, not because they're asking you to put a band-aid or to react to something that's already occurred, right?
Yes, because it's a tough investment in Nader Associates. I deal with people who want to be honest, unequivocally introspective of the need for their intervention concerns, and their willingness to take a contrarian perspective. I am a contrarian. I do not agree with you because you tell me to agree with you. I agree with you when you're doing the right thing, and we've collaborated in achieving the right thing.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. So you're not stuck in that place of inauthenticity, people pleasing, being a yes man.
Right.
I think that's the mark of anybody that's bringing forward something that is needed in the current, where the world is heading,
Well,
is that
thank you.
ability to not be pretentious or fake, or let me just tell you what you want to hear. Um,
Yes.
so I know in our work, we have a process that we move people through from that place of being fake. We call it pseudo community, where you just pretend everything's okay.
Yes.
And what happens is over time, people realize not everything is agreed upon, not everything is okay. And how they respond at that moment is what causes them to either go into chaos with each other, where they get violent or aggressive or hostile with each other, or whether they move on to actually being receptive and being emotionally intelligent, which I know is where you and I both love to
Great.
guide people.
Yes,
Because
absolutely.
when people are in that fake place, they're using their power, they're underusing their power.
No
When they're
doubt.
in that hostile place, they're overpowering people.
Yes.
And this show is all about shifting them from power over and power under to power within and power between, which is what you and I have so much in common. So tell me a little bit about how you help the executive to understand that the movement is from that place of pretend or hostility into that place of let's all find a way to hear one another. Because that's what I know about you, is that you are a person that practices respect and recognition and being able to be receptive and teaching people to be receptive to one another and to be recognizing what are our differences from a place of appreciating that instead of reacting to that. So we're going to take a very short break, and when we come back, I want to hear your play on how you guys bring that about.
I'll be here. I'll be here. Wait for you.
Welcome back, everyone, to When Everyone Wins and my discussion with Felix Nater on how to create win-win culture shifts that shift violence into caring community. And before the break, we talked a little bit about how people try to pretend caring community at times, and they become people pleasers and they become fake and inauthentic. And then they move to a stage where they start to get real with each other. But if they don't know how to do that in an effective way, that often is where things turn chaotic, where people go into power struggles and they're sort of in that I'm right, you're wrong, win-lose mindset. And the thing that Felix and I have in common is that we move people beyond either of those stages. And so I want Felix to talk about how he goes about that process.
Thank you, Judy. I said earlier that I love what I do, but I would also love organizations to really wrap their arms around your message. Because if they were to wrap their arms around your message, they would effectively put me out of business. When you think about it, when they hire an employee, they don't hire a criminal. They don't hire someone that is going to go postal. So why not maximize in that investment and create a culture and environment that is supportive? Mutually and collaborative support goes a long way. I believe that in order for really embrace my philosophy of my violence interdiction model, which consists of 3 or 4 processes, you have to be practical, and you have to be honest with yourself, and you have to have the right mindset. And the right mindset means stop checking the box. Just because SHRM or just because OSHA or just because some security organization says you gotta do these best practices, develop best practices that are unique and relevant to your organization, right? So if you have a strategy that says we will not tolerate behavior XYZ under zero tolerance, okay, well, develop best practices that never get you to enforcing the disciplinary actions, right?
Yeah.
Get to best practices that empower employees to feel as though they're part of the solution and not the experiencing of negative consequences for poor behavior. So I think wrapping their arms around recognizing their responsibility to lead as opposed to look for the opportunity to discipline is a better mindset that's practical and that's appreciated by adults who come to work to be contributing members of their employment environments.
Yes, you're so right. We're not hiring criminals generally.
Right.
Once in a while, one might get in under the wire, but in general, people are great and they want to be great. And something that you just said, Felix, that really reminded me of another parallel between your organization and ours, is we teach a very powerful tool called redirecting negative behavior. And it's taught over 3 months because there's a lot of complexity to it. It's a very dynamic tool, but we
Interesting.
always tell people we don't even present it till month 6. Because if you do the right things in months 1 through 5, or actually not month 7, if you do all of those things to build trust and create emotional and social intelligence and psychological safety and blah, 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 you don't have so many negative behaviors to redirect. And
Absolutely.
that's exactly what you're talking about. So we're so quick to want a reactive kind of a tool, but it's a lot more complicated than that to get us into that place. So you
And let
talk a
me
little
add,
bit
Judy, let
about,
me answer that point.
yeah,
I'm sorry to talk over you.
no, please do.
Supervisors and managers, by virtue of those two titles, think they're leaders. And
Mhm.
managers and supervisors, if they really understood what it was they were doing, would understand that the people are the ones who make those programs successful.
Yes.
They make you successful because you've influenced their behavior in a positive way. And when an adult employee recognizes that they're being influenced and they're being couched into doing what's the right thing, they become contributing members of the society. So what's lacking from my perspective, is leadership. There's more management and there's more authoritative supervision than there is leadership, development, guidance, and instructions to create that awareness, that creates the investment on the part of the employee to be part of the solution.
I love everything you just said because you talked about leaders being influencers and influencing people to operate from the inside out on what's the right thing to do, as
Yeah.
opposed to what you called management or authoritarian type of control models,
Yes.
right?
Right.
So what
Right.
you're doing is first educating the leaders, even though I think your model, like mine, is very distributive. Everybody's involved. But
Yes.
you're also starting out by kind of setting the leaders straight on the downside to using a lot of domineering power over kind of dynamics where it doesn't pull out the power within people to be using that power, as a positive force for the organization.
Absolutely.
That an
And
actual,
an example of that, what's going on in our country with all of the issues that are affecting our mindsets, our emotional and psychological imbalances, if you would. A leader, supervisor, or manager would be gathering all their employees together and saying, we are committed and devoted to your mental well-being and to your enjoyment of your work. These are the issues that are affecting our society. However, I want to remind you, this is how a leader speaks, how important you are to us. So if you have issues and concerns, elevate them to us and we'll sit down and we'll find solutions to the concerns. That's what leaders in the workplace should be doing. But oftentimes the bottom line dictates their behavior and their priorities are focused on generating results rather than looking after the people that generate the results.
yeah. Yes, it's profitability more than people and purpose and principles.
I find
And,
that to
and
be
I
the
love
case.
that you said a good leader wants their people to enjoy their role in the organization.
No doubt.
My mission statement for my company is to create a world in which all people love their lives. And in the early days, marketing people would say, oh, that's never going to fly with businesses because they don't care if their people love their
Oh my
lives.
goodness.
Well, what you and I are saying is a really good leader does care if their employees are loving their lives. It's their fear that they don't know how to get them there that I think often gets in the way. How do you, I know you probably, like me, find that there's some kind of resistance to that, like, oh, that sounds too kumbaya-ish, or, how do you overcome
Yeah.
even the leadership resistance to helping shift out of power over people to developing the power within people and guiding it well? How do you do that?
So I said earlier that my ideal client, they are my ideal client because they've done research long before they've contacted me and they pretty much know who I am. So I wear two hats. I wear the consultant guy hat that helps you become familiar and aware of everything that my processes suggest you might want to consider doing. And then there's the bad guy hat that results in me coming in and doing assessments relative to some behavior that contributed to a hostile work environment or the commission of a crime that falls under my purview that I have to resolve. I don't want to be there. Management, if they do what they're supposed to do in a more leadership oriented fashion, they will have employee trust and confidence in them to be able to elevate their concerns before it becomes an issue. So my focus is on process that deals with my model, which is LC3, which is leadership, collaboration, coordination, communication, training, and execution. and I work through this process with my clients, get them to understand, if you appreciate where I'm coming from and you wrap around your arms around this process, long after I'm gone, you'll be thinking of me, but you'll have the skill sets to understand why they're important. So you have to really appreciate that just because you have a zero tolerance policy doesn't mean that's your scapegoat. That's your opportunity. That's your hammer over the employee's head to use whenever you feel you need to control them. You need to manage them. No, good leaders are constantly setting the standard and reminding people of what the standards are and encouraging them to be a part of the solution. And they also create an environment, Judy, where the employee trusts the supervisor or the manager that their issue is going to be in fact resolved. So if I have an employee that's underneath me and she has or he has children that need to get to the babysitter before they come to work, I'm going to know that employee's problems. And I'm going to know that he or she may be coming to work a few minutes late, or he or she might to leave the workplace a few minutes earlier, but I'm not going to use that against them because in between those hours, Judy, guess what? They are highly productive and they're highly contributory. So leading is a part of the issue that creates a framework in the hearts and minds of our employees to want to be part of a greater contribution that is culturally oriented to the employer's high level culture, that all people have value.
Yes, yes. So much of what you're saying that really good leaders are proactive. They're proactively looking at how do I develop my staff so that they're happy being here, so that they are excited and willing rather than compliant and, meeting that no tolerance kind of hammer hanging over their head. That
Yes,
language
unfortunately.
almost has that feeling of do it or else versus, hey, we're not even going to put you in that monster box that you're going to do something wrong. We're going to sit down together and figure out what is working and what's not working. And we're all going to work it out with our guidance of that process as leaders. And that's a shift for some companies, right?
It really is because they lead with authority, that hollow authority that has no sticking power. It doesn't intimidate. It only frightens people to say, well, if they don't treat me with dignity and respect, I'll go somewhere else.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that's a false investment because you've taken all this time and energy and finances to bring someone in that's highly contributory, and you diminish their value by mistreating them. So I think once the employer recognizes that warm and fuzzy will prevent Felix Nater from ever being invited into the organization, again, for the wrong reasons.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because warm and fuzzy, excuse me, sounds a little bit like when we call it soft skills.
Yes,
In some ways, there's also nothing warm and fuzzy or soft,
right.
but it's not mean or hard either.
That's right.
Because what you're really describing is how do I bring in healthy authority, not unhealthy authority? Because when we're in unhealthy authority, we're trying to dominate, we're trying to get compliance. We'll settle for people doing things resentfully just to get them to check the box that they're doing them.
Absolutely.
And you're really describing something much different than that, which is really a harder but more fulfilling thing, which is to help people develop their willingness from the inside out and their desire to be a contributing member.
What you want to create is a contributing member of the workforce that appreciates coming to work every single day, and that appreciates your efforts, and that they're intentionally designed to be helpful and worthy, so that if something were to go wrong, that good employee could take the witness stand and say they did absolutely nothing to provide for a safe and secure workplace. Or they could say they tried to do the best they could, and I understand their efforts and I understand their contributions. And that's the employee, and that's the culture you want to create.
Yes. When we come back from the break, let's talk a little bit more about how do we create that kind of relationship dynamic between all the levels of an organization. Welcome back to my listeners to our session here with Felix Nater on creating win-win culture to prevent violence. And before our break, we started to talk a little bit about how to move people into that place, leaders in particular, to where they're willing to set down those control models. Felix. I know we specifically do that when we tie that to people's feelings of shame and inferiority. We almost immediately go into how various control models cause people to be afraid because there's a fearful and limiting belief you're holding about the employee when you're doing those control models. How do you approach that so that you help those leaders to make that mindset shift? Because it's so conditioned in us from the time we were raised as little kids at home and in many of our schools. It's no wonder that people come into the workplace and try to do the same thing.
Yes, I try to help leaders understand that just because they're supervisors or managers doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be dictators.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
try to convey the importance of influencing the outcome by creating an environment where the employee feels comfortable and trusting of sharing their situation. And that sharing of a situation could entail reporting the behavior of a coworker. And that only happens when there's trust and confidence in that supervisor or manager that would create a healthy feeling in the employee's heart and mind that everything is going to be worked out to the satisfaction of all involved. So I try to get them to appreciate that resolving the issue and finding out what the root causes and contributing factors are open up the system to opportunities to correct itself, to improve itself. If the employee says the one supervisor does it this way, another supervisor does it that way. One supervisor informs you of when they're going to change the schedule, the other one does it arbitrarily. One supervisor thinks that he's not bullying me when he doesn't authorize my request for leave, but he doesn't see it as bullying, and I do because he's been notified with sufficient time. So I just move the tables around and I say, put yourself in the heart and mind of the employee. And how would you feel if you had an important event to occur and you went to your supervisor a month in advance, and then a week out, your schedule changed and the employee's leave was disapproved? You've got to create an environment where psychologically they feel comfortable about coming to you with all of their issues, no matter what the problem may be, and then give you an opportunity up front to address those issues. But that's an organizational commitment and an organizational investment in people safety and security that typically isn't a sign, typically isn't something I see as a sign of commitment.
Yeah, it's really, the newer phrase that what you're really kind of talking about in this moment is psychological safety. Because if an employee doesn't feel safe enough to tell you things, it's because they're afraid of you. And if the employer is not willing to ask the tough questions and hear the tough things that may have to be said, or they think that it's time not well spent, then they're not going to necessarily make those commitments to have that effective, open, trustworthy conversation. I think it's also challenging for leaders. You can tell me your feelings on this, Felix, but I think leaders are afraid if I open that can of worms of hearing everyone's problems, now I've got to be the fix it guy or gal, right? Whereas in our world, the best way you can fix it is to help other people learn how to fix their own challenges with your support and the supportive systems so that they don't feel like all they're left doing is going up to a higher authority in the company and telling on this person. So it's a combination of having somebody there, like you said the phrase where all parties concerned are going to be considered. So that
Yes.
feeling of I'm not for just the company's interests, I'm not just for the employee's interests, I'm not just for the accused perpetrator of something, but
Right.
for everyone involved to learn and grow and fix this as best we can without
Yes.
getting anyone out of it. Is that accurate to say, Felix?
Yes. I have a saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It may create more work for you, but knowing upfront of a contributing factor that may have an adverse impact on your business, your organization, your operation, will put you in a leadership function to be able to address that problem before it becomes a major issue for the organization. But oftentimes what we do is we focus in on the priority, on the organizational priority, and dismiss the importance of the people who are the drivers of the priorities, who ensure that the priorities are accomplished. And there's a gap there that employees perceive, and rightfully so, as you don't really care about me, you just care about the bottom line. And so when an employee understands that they only care about the bottom line, they switch off and they only care about themselves. And so when it's 9 o'clock, they report at 9 o'clock. And when it's time to leave at 5 o'clock, they leave at 5 o'clock. There is no afterthought of a contributing factor that I could offer that came to mind on my way home because they don't care about me. And so why should I care about you? So while people may look at what I do as violence prevention, really it's efficiency improvement. Is how do you
Yeah,
get the mindset, right, of the employee to want to be a contributing member of the organization?
I think in the beginning, what you said is true, that in the beginning it is more effort, but in the end, it's a time saver, it's a money saver, it's a all kinds of saver.
No doubt. It really is. But you got to create that mindset in the senior leadership of the organization that appreciates the saying, an ounce of prevention is really worth a pound of cure. It's how much do you invest and what kind of an atmosphere do you create? Do you resolve employee issues immediately or do you put them off? Because I tell the story, and give you a few seconds to tell the story. I tell the story of an employee who says, I've got a problem and I need to be able to see my supervisor. And if I don't see my supervisor, I'm going to have issues that are going to prevent me from coming to work. They think it's not important and they eventually say, I'll get to it. And before you know it, coworkers are saying, you know why Felix went postal? Because he had some issues and nobody was listening to him with his issues. And the only solution was for him to do what he did. But if someone had taken time to be leaders and not just holders of titles, they may have learned that he was going through a terrible divorce, and that terrible divorce was impacting his mental psyche. And as a result, he was being focused upon in the workplace as being unproductive, inefficient, and he took that personally. And who was his victims? Those of us in the workplace. So
Right.
leaders have to understand that what they do has a positive as well as an adverse impact on their workforce.
Yeah, I wonder, Felix, and I don't know if this is a fair question to throw at you because we haven't talked about this even before, but I can hear that you're putting a lot of emphasis on the leaders, and absolutely, that's one of the things we do when we start with a client. In fact, we don't even take on a project unless people at all the highest levels are participating with people at the front line. You know,
Yes.
that those levels are mixed. At the same time, do you ever see the other side of that coin where the employees also have a commitment to step up to being willing to be responsible? Because what I see is that as a society, people at all levels are really more conditioned to just do what they're told than think for themselves and take personal ownership and responsibility. And a lot of times when an employee is complaining about a leader, there is a role that that employee is also participating in.
Yes.
We have a
Yes.
story we tell often of an eighth grader who was complaining because he was being bullied by his homeroom teacher, and he was. But what he wasn't seeing is that he was aware after being asked that he wanted peace, but he also didn't see how he was doing more with the teacher. That was his contribution. And once he could see those things, he was able to make a deeper commitment to, I really do want peace, so I'm willing to go that extra step to cause it.
Right.
Kind of the same process that the employer or the leader needs to go through. Sometimes it's also equally, at least in our experience, important that those in the frontline staff even come to the table with commitments to be a team, right?
Yes. It's the old saying, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But you have to really wrap your arms around the meaning and the benefit that can be derived from practicing that philosophy. When an employee sees your trust and credibility is honorable, there is nothing that employee will not do for you. However, when you contradict the expectations, the employees no longer trust you. And when they don't trust you, the supervisor or manager is the last person to know when things are going wrong because there's no trust to be garnered from that relationship. So it's important that when we teach, at least when I approach my philosophy to prevention, I talk about employee responsibilities, supervisor responsibilities, manager responsibilities, C-suite responsibilities, and organizational responsibility. Because if they're not integrated and collaborating among themselves, and there's a chasm that's built, employees are the first to pick up on the fact that it's just talk and no walk that goes along with the talk. And once we create that distrust, employees no longer will come to you, and you'll be the last person to know when Felix decides to go postal.
Right. That's why so many people are taken off guard when somebody quits because they don't even know they're unhappy because there's no real open communication for that.
Sure.
So,
Absolutely.
will you tell us again the name of your process? I think it was LC something. Would you
Yes,
tell
it's
us about
leadership, which is very important, all the aspects of the leadership component that you need to be aware of upfront in terms of your responsibilities and your commitment and investment to safety and security. There's collaboration, there's coordination, there's communication, and coordination is how will you disseminate this information so that your workforce, from the leadership right on down to your lowest employee, understands their personal responsibilities and what those resources are. There is communication of the effort. How do you convey the information? Are you doing it through training purposes? Are you doing just through memos? Are you removed from connecting with your people? And then there's the coordination of effort. How do you ensure that the communication and the collaboration are viable for your organization? What are the measurement systems that you have in place to evaluate their effectiveness, right? And then there's the training so that everybody receives the same message. Supervisors a little bit more than the workforce, and managers a lot more than supervisors might get. So they understand their personal and professional commitment. But the consistency in the application of what is intended or desired has to be conveyed in a way where the workforce respects the message, because you're walking the walk and talking the talk and not being contradictory. So that whole formula that I use, which is part of my consulting and training services, focusing on the entire organization, because in the end, if the execution isn't honorable and doesn't have integrity, there is no sense in going forward, because the workforce will be the first to see your inconsistency.
So it's leadership,
Leadership,
collaboration,
collaboration, coordination, communication, training, and execution.
And that's where everybody has to be involved. We'll talk a little bit more about that aspect after we come back from our break.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone, to my show, When Everyone Wins. And I have somebody who loves win-win with me today, which is the only way we're going to shift violence into caring community. And that's with Felix Nater. Felix, I'm so excited that you're going to talk next about how do we get everybody involved, and how do you assess things, and how do you guide the leaders and sharing information. Can you tell us some more about how that happens in your—
Absolutely. So if you're legitimately invested in creating a safe and secure workplace, you have to have processes in place. My process is being able to assess and evaluate where you currently are, and then glean from those reportings what you need to do to address the problem that concerns the workplace. Within each assessment, there's an opportunity for the employee to be interviewed, for managers and supervisors to be interviewed, as well as senior members of the team to be interviewed. And each generates output for me to be able to focus in specifically in determining what the solutions that I can offer once I identify possible problems and their contributing factors. Understanding this process is key, because you just can't come in and do training. Training is just the recognition of specific content and topics after you recognize what the problems are. To come in and just do training because you want to pay someone $10,000 to fulfill a budgetary justification is just the poor way of managing your money. You want to create an environment where long after you've gone, people are reverberating with your message. They'll say things like, wow, didn't Felix say this? And why aren't we doing this? Or when a supervisor says, you see, training has to have a connection with the output. Otherwise, training just becomes perfunctory. And a manager says, I've been saying what Felix has been saying for years. Accountability, responsibility have to have consequences. And we're responsible for creating an environment that's healthy and conducive for productive employees. So my assessments go into each level to identify what in the heart and mind of an employee bothers them. What in the heart and mind of the organization bothers them, and then to sit back and do the collective assessment that ties all of these pieces together and renders a report that says your culture is contradictory to your statements of infactual, if you would, or not true observations. Because here's what I found. I found supervisors who were left alone to fend for themselves. I found employees who offer suggestions and ideas that go absolutely nowhere. And then I find your inconsistency in the application of your own policies, plans, and procedures. And we've got to come together. And how do we come together? By putting into place these recommendations that my final report is going to render, and hopefully being able to generate a more coalescing, cohesive approach to workplace safety and security. Because right now, when employees report things to you, they feel nothing is being done to resolve their issues and concerns.
So along those lines, Felix, when you have an organization take an assessment or several assessments, it sounds like you have, do
Yes.
you guide the leadership to share all of the results, the good, bad, and the ugly, with the employees and get their buy-in to the next steps? Is that part of your process?
It can't work without that process being in place. For me to render a report, and then be invited back in to do an incident assessment that involves a physical altercation with people, I'm going to ask you for those documents, and I want to be able to associate the contributions you did to prevention so that I can honestly render a report that says the organization had these things in place. This was an anomaly of an event that transpired. The players involved are apologetic. It was a momentary lapse of judgment, and everything is cohesively engaged, and management is behind it, as opposed to going into an organization where they have nothing in place other than a zero tolerance policy that says failure to do X, Y, and Z could result in discipline. Well, we all know that, but what are we doing to ameliorate? What are we doing to educate? What are we doing to prevent those employees who feel as though they have issues and want to come forward to educate their employer so that they can be contributing members of a peaceful environment versus to release their anger because no one is listening to them? And in
Right,
most of the
right.
cases, people don't listen to their employees.
So my question though is, when they've done an assessment with the employees and they've
Yes.
gotten that feedback, do you educate the leaders on how to make sure that their employees know that they've finally been heard?
Yes, the assessment is designed to sit down with the senior managers of the organization and review the findings and then discuss how we're going to resolve those findings to minimize impact in the future or to resolve those or to prevent those particular events from reoccurring.
I think my question is a little different from that, because
Yes.
what I hear frontline staff saying, who are not manager, who are not supervisor, is I answer all these questions on surveys and then I never hear another word about it. So like in our work, when we do what is called a strategic alignment assessment, we uncover a lot of things around trust, alignment, engagement, things like, do your people even know what your purpose, core values, and visions are? And if they do know, do they approve of them? Those kinds of
Yes.
questions. And
Yes.
we measure at the beginning, the middle, and the end of a first pilot project. But what my question is what a lot of employees complain about is, yeah, you asked my opinion, but then I never heard another word about it. So what we do is, when we generate a report, we always recommend that the leaders distribute it to all of the employees and that they have meetings to discuss it and how it's going to be addressed in the pilot project. So
Correct.
that's a very clear path of, oh, they're not just saying they want to hear what I have to say. They're willing to even tell me the ugly things that they discovered about themselves, about the
Yes.
leadership of the company. So do you have a process like that that you?
Yes. Yes. So in the recommendation section, I will state those things that need to be followed in order for us to have a successful outcome to the efforts in the investment of the invested in the assessment process. And one of the recommendations, to your point, would be educate the employees on their responsibilities, train supervisors in their responsibilities, remove barriers to communications, um, create an environment where reporting is okay, provided that there's a recommendation and a solution associated with the report. So we try to create an environment where it's healthy, there's collaboration, and everyone is talking to themselves. However, in most of my engagements, the clients that hire me want to know what the problems are, but don't oftentimes invest in the resolution of the problems. They just want to know what the problems are, but don't invest in the resolution. And oftentimes the employee who sits in front of me as part of my assessment, he'll listen to my questions, and then he'll ask questions of me. And then he'll go back to his supervisor and say, Mr. Nader says that he is going to address X, Y, and Z. I'm going to hold you accountable to the fact that he said these matters would be addressed. And oftentimes there's a gap in the accountability of the supervisor and management where things don't get done. And the unions feel as though it was a waste of the effort and investment in bringing someone in like me when the communication gaps are still not resolved.
Yeah, I think it comes down to how do you create a caring relationship that is power within and power between and power for one another, because otherwise that imbalance of power is what sets that gap and creates that fear.
Yes.
Right. And so what you're saying is that through all of the communication part of the 3 C's, you're really focusing on how do you, like, let me put it this way. When you
Yeah.
started today with me, you admitted it took me 8 years to learn how to get really good at all of this, right? That's a leader that people can trust because automatically they're not presenting as some kind of superhero. And so what I think you're really also teaching, maybe I see it and you aren't sure that you've said it, but I see you as somebody that's also teaching leadership vulnerability so that their people can see there's nothing to be afraid of here. I'm a human being right along with you. Would that be accurate to say?
There, I would say it's accurate to say simply because they are fearful that when they admit what you just said needs to be admitted, that they're going to be held culpable should something happen down the road.
Yeah. Or that they're going to be punished that it even is already there.
If that is already there, someone recognized that it already exists.
Yeah.
So while I may render a report that's critical, I would hazard to say that the findings of my report don't always get discussed as I recommend they should be discussed because it reveals things that they don't want to share either with their superiors or amongst themselves, and certainly not with the workforce.
Well, what you're really describing is a culture of fear as opposed to a culture of openness, trustworthiness, and safety. And so that's where you and I are so clear that what causes violence or any kind of struggle, small or large,
Yes.
is that fear that something is going to happen to me because I'm going to be judged, I'm going to be criticized, I could lose my job. And it's happening on both sides of the issue. And that's what I love that you and I are both talking about is yes, the fear is instilled in the employee at times, but it's also in the employer. You know, the
Well,
employer has that fear of being exposed or looking like I've set an open door to get attacked, when in reality, vulnerability is a strength. Wouldn't you agree?
I agree. Vulnerability is a strength. Honesty is a strength. And I'll give you an example. In a client existence that I have right now, 10 years ago, an employee came to me with a problem. 5 years later, another employee comes to me with the same problem this employee had 5 years earlier. I finally sit down with management and I'm saying, what good is it for me to render a detailed report of my findings and recommendations when the resolution of the employee's problems aren't being resolved? And
Yes.
this particular manager was very concerned because he noted that this particular operation was having those kinds of problems, poor communication, poor leadership, poor management that other departments were not having.
Felix, I love everything we've talked about because where I see the win-win is in creating that dynamic between everybody in every role, whether it's authority figure to direct report or direct report to authority figure or peer to peer. And I wish we could talk forever on this show, but unfortunately we have to wrap it up. So what I want to say in wrapping it up is I appreciate the fact that you and I are a different gender, a different race, possibly a different age, I don't know, and different background for sure, which we all are. And yet we come together to create win-win, to bring people into the best version that they can be. Because we don't want to shy away from talking about violence or struggles or negative behavior, but we want to hold it in the context of people are great. And if we work together to help them feel great and to
Yes.
know themselves as great, we're eradicating the fear, we're eradicating the suffering, we're creating the trust. And I love that about you, Felix. I'm so
Yes.
grateful that you are out there beside me, with me, helping the communities grow in being fearless and believing in each other. So
And
thank
that's the
you.
way we ought to go. Thank you. I think for the most part, when leaders are trained with our philosophies in mind, the outcome is favorable because honesty is the best policy. Sometimes, as a leader, you have to couch how it's presented, but honesty is the best policy.
Yeah. And let's leave the listeners with, create the conditions where you're honest, open, and trustworthy so that you can intentionally cause win-win. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to When Everyone Wins, where we're shifting power over and under to power within and between. I'm Judy Ryan, your transformation talk radio host. Tune in each second and fourth Monday at 9 a.m. Pacific time to learn new concepts and tools and listen to conversations I have with thought leaders and change agents. You'll also see real-world applications of what I'm covering so that you experience the power of the concepts and tools I share. In each episode, I bring you my knowledge from decades in workplace culture transformation and leadership development as the founder and CEO of LifeWorks Systems. I invite you to call in with your unique stories and questions. The path to ensure that everyone wins depends on our ability as people to create a life we love and help others do the same. For more information, visit lifeworksystems.com.